California is a step closer to giving reparations to millions of black residents descendant from enslaved people. Now, the state task force presented more than 100 recommendations to legislators last week after more than 2 years of research and public hearings. They include payments that could exceed $1 million in some cases. The task force is also calling for free college tuition for those eligible for reparations and funding for wellness centers in majority black neighborhoods. Elise Preston spoke to some of those people whose lives could be affected if the reparations become reality.
A descendant of racial trauma.
Were their parents enslaved?
No, their grandparents
were enslaved.
Gloria Pirro-Dyer carries the DNA of ancestors who painfully worked on plantations in Georgia and Louisiana.
In the late 1800s, someone in our family was lynched. So the family retaliated. So to escape from what they knew would be a violent reaction, they left Louisiana in the middle of the night, and they kind of scattered to different places.
Her family would eventually settle in the historically black community of Allensworth, California in the 1950s, hoping for a safe, prosperous life. But Pirro-Dyer recalls seeing firsthand the evils of hatred as a young child.
My father was able to buy an actual farm, but the difficulty was it had no well. And he, being a black man, was having great difficulty getting a loan to have a well put in.
If you would have had the well sooner, do you think about what could have happened for your family financially?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We could have been so much farther ahead, you know. There were so many things we could have done had we had water.
For generations, black Californians have battled systemic oppression. During California's gold rush, thousands of enslaved black Americans were trafficked from southern states to labor in California's mines and face persecution, even though the state's constitution outlawed slavery.
We had lynchings in here in California, which a lot of people don't understand.
California Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer served on the state's reparations task force and will now use its findings to propose a reparations bill to fellow state lawmakers.
Not being able to own your own businesses, not being able to have access to capital, not being able to be hired and move up and matriculate, all of those things kept us from being able to rise naturally.
The California Task Force economists calculate descendants in its state lost out on more than $500 billion in wealth from over-incarceration, shortened lifespan, and business devaluation alone. But cash payouts won't necessarily equal that figure. That's now up to lawmakers.
So moving forward, you have this 1,000-page report, roughly, that you're drafting into a bill. What does that look like?
It is a daunting task. Even just doing one thing is going to be extremely difficult.
Jones Sawyer believes California could provide the blueprint to renew the national reparations effort.
Can those recommendations truly reverse all of the harms that black people have gone through?
We may not totally get there, but we're going to be so much better than if we had never done anything.
More than half of the country believes the legacy of slavery still impacts black Americans today. Still, roughly 2/3 of Americans do not support reparations.
I really think it's a distraction.
Bob Woodson is among the 17% of black Americans not in favor of reparations.
So what would you say is the legacy of slavery?
It is a part of our past. It was brutal. Oppression is a part of the story, and it should be told. But we should never define ourselves by what disabled us.
Pirro-Dyer defines her family as survivors who persisted despite atrocities and anguish.
What are you hoping generations from now the world looks like for your descendants?
I hope that racism will be eliminated. Racism is taught, and if it has been taught and learned, it can be unlearned.
Recognizing the past and reconciling for the future. For CBS Mornings, Elise Preston, Los Angeles.
I mean, it's quite a task. I don't know how you calculate the potential loss and literally whittle it down to a dollar figure because money really isn't enough per se. But I think it's really good that California has taken this seriously and sort of started this conversation.
In part because they're the you know, as the biggest state, they're the one that often does something like this first on environmental stuff, consumer safety.
And you had this thing in LA with Bruce's Beach where they gave it back to the family who they'd taken it from, and then they sold it back to the city, which kind of worked out for everybody because it's about generational wealth, and those resources you just don't have if you've had, you know, discrimination for generations.
Well, thank you, Elise, for that.
Thanks,
Glad you
Elise.
called it out.